Good day all. I'm Dr. Nico Buitendach. I'm a postdoc here at Northwest University, and I'm going to deliver a guest lecture for you in this course on the topic of the right to resist. So this is not instead of the normal lecture, this is more of a supplement. And what I thought of, instead of engaging with the ideas that your lecturers will on this topic, I will try to place it within a broader context, historical context, and show you how these ideas developed through time, and also try to show some angles on this topic that are specifically applicable to the South African past. So let's get into it. The right to resist. In the three readings that you have for this theme, the question at the root of it, in my opinion, is the question of legal legitimacy. Why should we follow the law? And we can see this story unfolding through these three papers kind of chronologically. Now, as a small warning that you should keep in mind is that this story that I'm presenting is a simplified version. What happened in reality is not this linear movement. At all times, we've always had conflicts and different opinions on this topic. This is just a rough guide to help you make sense of it a little bit more, but keep in mind that it is more complicated, and that history never moves in clean phases. So, talking about the three papers, I think there's a certain structure to them that I want to highlight here. We could say that the first paper talks about the source of law being based in natural law, the center of the circle on your screen. The second paper then talks about civil disobedience. What happens when we don't agree with a certain law because perhaps we think it's against natural law? And then the third paper talks about a wholesale rejection of the legal legitimacy of the state. So, let's get going. So, on the first paper, I think this paper makes a case basically for the legitimacy of law being rooted in natural law. Now, I'm sure you've already done, or you will soon do, this distinction between natural law and positivism. So, just to recap, natural law is the basic idea that man-made laws are not justified ultimately in the constitution or the state, but a value higher, outside of the law, outside of the government, outside of human society. So this was traditionally in the past justified through an appeal to God. Others argue that nature, or the world, or society, but let's call it nature, is a rational system, and it has a logic and it has rules. And through our human reason, through our intellect, through thinking hard enough about these questions, we can find some real truth with a capital T that should be applicable in all times, everywhere in the world, to everyone. So, the law is ultimately always justified in a final cause. The buck stops somewhere. And we saw that in older societies, this was often in God as embodied by the Catholic Church. So when the first paper talks about Luther and the Reformation, just to remind you, what happened there was that for over a millennium you had the Catholic Church in Western Europe that was very powerful and very involved in people's lives on a political and legal level too. These systems were not separated, they were a lot more intermingled. And Martin Luther and his followers and other important figures were dissatisfied with some of the things that the Catholic Church were doing and decided to protest against that. This led to religious conflict across Europe for many years, very violently. People took this very personally, whether they were on the side of the Catholic Church or on the side of the Protestants, and bloody wars waged across Europe for a long time. And there was a need to bring peace back. And one of the solutions that was found was to, instead of having people see themselves primarily as Catholics or as Protestants, to see them as communities based around a nationality. So governments or states had to be formed that controlled a territory, and the people within that territory formed some kind of community. So one of the classic points in history for this development were the Treaties of Westphalia, where the separation of church and state was being made more clear for the first time, so that people with different religious opinions could still live in peace together. And that if there was a fight between a religious war between people in one part of Europe, it did not affect this part of Europe. It had to be separated by a national border. A lot of the intellectual groundwork for this was done by Thomas Hobbes in his famous book, The Leviathan, where he argued for this idea that the church and state has to be separated, and that the law did not come from, while he was still a natural law thinker, the law did not come necessarily from God, but from human reason and common sense. So while monarchs for a while still claimed the divine right to rule, as states secularized, meaning separating themselves from the church, a new justification had to be found for following the law. We could not say anymore that we have to follow it because it comes from God. The law had to find its justification internal to itself. And therefore, what developed was the social contract theories, the idea that within a state, within a society, the laws have to be followed because all of the citizens have willingly submitted themselves to this authority, and that they did so because their reason or common sense told them that that was the best way to organize their lives. So we see a move from the justification in natural law coming from the top down to suddenly turning around and coming from the bottom up. And this was most powerfully illustrated in the founding of America after the American Revolution, and in France after the French Revolution. So moving to the next paper by Allen, he really goes for this second form, where the legitimacy of the law is based on the consent of those that are being governed, or the social contract theory, which he ties specifically to the right to freedom of speech, which, as we know, is very important in the United States. It's less important in South Africa, but it's still in our Bill of Rights in Article 16 of the Constitution. So the idea is that through this social contract, we are still obliged to follow the law because it makes sense, and we have all agreed to this. But being free individuals, we still have the reason or the intellect to judge each law, whether it applies to us or not, whether we do actually agree with it or not, on a case-by-case basis. So Alan argues that in the case where your reason tells you, whether you base this religiously or not, when your reason tells you that a certain law is unjust, it should not apply to you, and that you can resist or object to it. And that this is an extension of your freedom of speech, which is your freedom of expression and your freedom of belief. So we see the shift from the top-down natural law theory to the kind of bottom-up social contract theory. But thirdly, I want to discuss another alternative, one where neither of these are convincing. And this is embodied by the third paper by Lucien van der Walt. Because as we saw in Alan's paper, it still works from the idea that people generally consent to the law and to the state. That it's in principle a good idea, and that some details we can disagree upon. But what happens if we reject the legal system that is given completely? And are there grounds for doing this? And this is the question that was in the minds of the people that Van der Walt writes about. So just to make his text a little bit easier, I thought there were probably some terms that are unclear or that you might not have seen before that I just quickly want to explain. The first one is the propaganda of the deed. And this has a connection to Alan's paper too, and the freedom of speech. So the propaganda of the deed is the idea of acting. This can be a violent act, but it doesn't have to be. Civil disobedience, or what the state would call terrorism, is possible, which is intended to express your dissatisfaction with the legal or political order, which is your freedom of speech. But the secondary function is to invite observers, your fellow citizens, to see your opinion in action. And perhaps you can convince them that way or not, whatever the case may be. So it's making clear and advertising your dissatisfaction through action. Now, this is not by any means a new idea. It has a very old history. Francis of Assisi was a famous example of a Catholic son of a very rich family who one day gave up all his possessions and became a monk and traveled Italy, helping people, preaching to people, helping those who are poor. He believed that through his actions, through the way that he lived his life, he was spreading the word of God and his beliefs. And I mean, we can go back millennia into the Bible and many parts of the world to see a similar principle being applied. The second term is syndicalism. Now, this is very closely related to what we now today know as trade unionism. it's the idea that the workplace should not be a hierarchically organized space with bosses and workers, and that the profit is shared unequally. Some people give orders, others follow orders, but rather that a workplace, a factory or a farm or a shop, any kind of small community or society, should be run completely democratically, everyone on the same flat level, no hierarchies, and that these small groups should make their own decisions to the benefit of themselves and to those around them. They shouldn't be told from upstairs or from outside how to run their lives or their community. The final term is domination. So this is the idea that state, political or legal structures that we have now is still given to us from the top down, and it's not being done democratically. Of course, we say that we live in a democratic country, but within this strand, these people would argue that voting every few years for a political party who then gets into power and just basically do what they want is not real democracy, and it's a form of domination and unjust or unjustifiable authority, and it doesn't have legitimacy. So these are just some of the terms. So how is this argued then? What, in this framework, what does the law mean, and the obligation or duty to obey the law? It rejects the social contract theories and says that the law is not based on consent, but is rather a codified expression of social antagonism or social power relations that keeps some people at the top and some people at the bottom. And the story of monarchs, but now the social contract theory that replaced the story of the monarchs, the justification of the monarchs, is just a story, that in fact nothing has changed. If we say that the law comes from the people, in practice, how can we see that? That's not practically the case. And this is based on a rejection of one of the ideas of Hobbes that we spoke of before, where Hobbes argued that without government, without rulers, and without strict laws, society would be chaos. That human nature is inherently selfish, and that when people are not controlled, those that are stronger, whatever form that takes, would exploit those that are weaker. And the world would be the law of the jungle, and we wouldn't have social order. Now, anarchist political theory rejects this idea about human nature and says that no, people are in fact social creatures that want to cooperate, that are equal, and often help those less fortunate than themselves or those that need help for the greater good of the society. And this idea of Hobbes has been very influential in the centuries since it's been written. And the theorists we're talking about want to reject that and say that no, people are perhaps not just animals, but that we are much kinder and gentler and brotherly towards each other than Hobbes thought. So, talking about Van der Wald's paper and some of the practical examples, one of the other important contexts that we have to understand for this paper that the period that he's talking about between the late 1800s and the early 1900s, South Africa was colonized by the British Empire. So in the late 1800s, this was 4 colonies. And then, as you know, from 1910 onwards, these 4 colonies were amalgamated into one, into basically what we understand as South Africa today. And all the different peoples in South Africa were forcefully and violently put under the British Crown. The second important thing to remember is that first diamonds were discovered, and then gold. And a lot of diamonds and a lot of gold. So this became a big interest of the British Empire, and suddenly you have this huge collection of workers getting together, needing to mine these resources from different groups all across South Africa and from abroad too. And you can well imagine mining is very hard work and very difficult conditions, and the pay was not good. So people were naturally unsatisfied. And then seeing the fruits of their hard work, the resources, being shipped off to Britain, to Queen Victoria. And naturally people became dissatisfied with this, very dissatisfied with this. Now, on what basis people did that surely would have been different. Some would say through natural law that this is using their intellect or their religious beliefs, saying that this is unjust. This doesn't make sense. If we talk about the social contract theories, it also doesn't stand, because these people would argue that they were put under British authority by violence. They never consented to this authority. So under what obligation are they to follow the British law, colonial law? So people started organizing into resistance groups, syndicalism. And it's important to note that these were some of the first non-racial organizations in South Africa, because that's consistent with the line of reasoning that there are no natural hierarchies between human beings based on any criteria, including race. So all workers should be able to express their dissatisfaction and participate democratically in their society. So these led to a lot of conflicts, strikes, and one of the most famous strikes, which Van der Walt talks about too, which is a big event in the history of South Africa and in labor relations, is the Rand Rebellion of 1922, which the colonial government at the time suppressed extremely harshly and violently. The army was called in, soldiers fired on miners, bombs were dropped from planes, mortars were fired. An extreme example of the state disciplining their own citizens because they dared to protest against their working and life conditions. One of the important reasons for this was because of the recent Russian Revolution that took place and the rise of communism in Russia, and the authorities in South Africa were very afraid that the same thing would happen in South Africa, and therefore these cases of civil disobedience, of strikes, of being unhappy with the laws was punished and policed with extreme violence. Something that echoed almost 100 years later with the Marikana massacre that you're aware of. So, that's it for the 3 papers. So what are some of the lessons that we can take from this? We see that the need to justify the rule of law has always existed. However, every time an argument comes up that justifies why the law should be followed, it's convincing, but it's only convincing for a while. Eventually, even if it's after a few centuries, the justification for following the law stops convincing a lot of people in society, and a new reason has to be found. And this keeps happening. This pattern keeps repeating itself because society changes, and the arguments for explaining our society do not reflect the reality on the ground anymore, so new answers have to be found. So this keeps shifting. And therefore, we still have people today who argue that the current justifications for the rule of law or the authority of the state is unjust and that it needs to be changed. But no doubt, even if that happens, further along down the line, those arguments will stop convincing too. This is just the nature of society. So I look forward to the discussion. We can talk about some more practical cases, or we can talk about the theory a bit more. But this is kind of the story, together with the more concrete lessons that your lecturers have pointed out to you. This is the story and the context that you should keep in the back of your mind as we go into the discussions. And thank you for listening to this, and I look forward to speaking to all of you. Thank you.